Welcome to Talmudic Treasures. Today we're learning Nazir page 41, which discusses an interesting argument in which we often find, as is somewhat the style, that instead of allowing your hair to continue to recede, a person will often just shave their hair off completely and have a bald look. And the question is that allowed? Especially that by doing so, one is cutting off the payas, the corners of one's hair. Now, it's not necessary for a person to have long payos that we find among many Hasidim, even though that is their tradition and custom. But one is supposed to at least allow the hair to grow to this line, where this bone line, and not to be able to have it completely shaven off, because that is actually a Torah prohibition that a person is not allowed to cut literally the corners of one's hair. So by shaving one's hair completely, the question is that something which is allowed? Now, it's interesting, right off the bat, there is an interesting machloket. There's a dispute whether or not if a person shaves their hair completely so that they're completely bald, is that under the prohibition of shaving? Now, maybe it's only if you actually do the shaving of this, but you remain the top. Maybe that is the prohibition. However, if a person would shave their hair completely, then maybe it's not an issue. This is based on the words in Hebrew, whether hakafas kol harosh, shma hakafa. By removing all of your hair, whether that falls under the prohibition. So one possible way of saying that it's allowed is, again, if you hold that shaving all of one's hair, or hakafas kol rosh, lo shma hakafa. The other question is what use. If a person uses a straight edge razor, or they use other methods, let's say, for example, they use scissors and they cut their hair extremely short, but not to the extent that literally it's destroying, so to speak, by removing the actual roots of the hair. So these are things that are up to debate. But interestingly enough, there are times in which not only is it not a problem to use a razor, but one is obligated to shave their entire head, or possibly even their beard. And this has to do with our tractate, which has to do with a Nazir. A Nazir is required to shave all of their hair completely at the end of the ceremony, at the end of being a Nazir. And not only that, but it says explicitly that a Nazir is supposed to use a razor. Now, this is quite fascinating because on one hand, you have the Torah that tells us there's a positive obligation to use a razor to shave, but yet we know there's a negative prohibition that you're not allowed to use a razor to shave in general. So we follow an interesting principle. Whenever you find a conflict between a positive commandment and a negative commandment, we want you to do the positive commandment, and it actually pushes off the negative one. This is also found when it comes to the law of shatnez. Shatnez is a prohibition which we don't necessarily understand. It's a chok that is not completely able to be, again, derived or understood, but one is not allowed to wear wool and linen together. You cannot have these two garments, or two materials rather, interwoven into one garment. You can wear a wool suit, you can wear linen, but you can't wear them together. However, even though that is a negative prohibition, if a person would have a talit, a prayer shawl, and that prayer shawl has a mixture of wool and linen, that actually is allowed. Why? The answer is, again, because a positive commandment can override a contradictory negative commandment. Of course, it is brought down by the opinion of Reish Lakish that if somehow you could avoid the violation of the negative prohibition, then it's better to do both and not violate anything. However, if you have the ability to take action, so even though it may cause an element of a violation, we'd rather you to be taking that action. And we can see from here that maybe this is an important lesson. Even though, of course, there's certain things maybe you shouldn't do, but it's so important to be proactive, to be able to step up and to do something. So much so that the Torah wants us to be proactive and not sit around, not to do anything, and just to remain lazy, that we want you to be proactive even in the event that it may end up being a violation of a negative prohibition.